This is the second of our CiviCon presentations that we make, and we're excited about our speaker tonight on placemaking, who will be introduced momentarily. But what I want you to know is a little bit of the background. Many of you were involved throughout, and so I'm repeating what you probably already know. But this activity started clear back in 21 is when it was recognized that we needed to do something in our community. There were surveys done. Lawrence, McKinney, and Elizabeth did surveys throughout the community, talked to hundreds of people, hours at a time, to identify what they saw in this community, what their vision was individually, what their impressions of our community was in the community. And based upon their work, it was determined that we needed to try and put together a visioning process that would allow us to get a diverse group of Norman citizens, try to get everybody in the community represented at the table so that we got all the views that were out there and really work through that to identify what we could find that we had a common view about, some big picture items that we could truly all get behind and try to move the needle forward for Norman towards these big picture items. So we had about 30, I think it was 36 member committee that created the process that we were going to utilize. We put applications out there for folks to seek to be a part of the visioning process with us, and worked very diligently in getting that group of about 100 people to be very representative of the community. We took every demographic you could take, and there were some good people that didn't get on that committee because their demographic was already well represented, and we just couldn't have too many of a particular demographic. So we think we did a pretty good job. Is it? Nothing's perfect. The outcome, probably not perfect, but it's good. It's very good, in my opinion, and we reached a lot of the vision that I think our community has. We established about 7 of what we're calling pillars for the community, and these are the big picture sort of goals that we have. Each of those pillars have 10, 12 sort of goals underneath them that came through the process that we used. And by the way, we used Oklahoma Academy. Julie Knudsen lives here in Norman. She's been running the Oklahoma Academy for years, and if you don't know what the Academy does, it's a statewide, nonpartisan, public policy organization that draws people from all over the state to come together and work on challenging political or policy problems that the state needs to address. And they do a wonderful job of getting a lot of diverse views around the table and arriving at a common goal or policy to put forward to the legislature. 80 some odd of the policies that have been developed in that way have been turned into law in the state of Oklahoma, so they're very successful and very good at that. So Julie was brought in because of that expertise in dealing with diverse viewpoints and finding a commonality out of those. And I think we did a good job of arriving at a document that we can use as a community. And what I want you to know going forward is that really it's not NEDC's job to execute on this vision. We're doing it right now. As you can tell tonight, this is our second CiviCon. So we're taking the reins at the moment, but we really feel like the visioning process needs to have a structure of its own and needs to have some leadership of its own. So we're hoping that out of this effort, there will spawn an organization that sees to it that you take that strategy, that vision off of a shelf and put it to work. And the only way you do that is to get involved with the various elements of our community that can execute on this vision and make sure they put it in their plan in a manner that's consistent with the vision that we've created. Then you've got a document that's living, working, and improving the lot of our Norman citizens the way the goal was originally set to do so. So, CiviCon, what is that? We coined that phrase, basically civic conversations, and the idea is that when a community lacks a vision it sometimes lacks the opportunity to come together, talk, discuss, and get involved. I think our voting record is a good indication that we are not engaged as a community. I mean, far too few people get involved with the community in a very essential way, and that's voting. So that's just a symptom of the challenge. The solution, we believe, is increasing our civic conscious, our awareness of things within the community. So CiviCon is an opportunity for us to get together, discuss, debate, and hear from experts from around the country that come in to help us in some of the elements that we have within the vision statement. And we've got a great one tonight for you to hear, and I appreciate the time you're investing by being here tonight and be a part of that. So with that, let me introduce my co-chair, who I was privileged to work with in the visioning process, Matt Peacock. If you'll come up and introduce our speaker tonight, greatly appreciate it.
Thanks, David. Yeah, so this is a topic that I'm very passionate about, placemaking. It's foundational to my private practice as an architect and also as my role as a city council member. So very excited to welcome James Lima tonight. James Lima, active in real estate, economic development, and public policy since 1986, founded JLP+D in 2011. With extensive experience in urban planning and revitalization, he led redevelopment strategies for large-scale sites and served as Senior Director of Development for AvalonBay Communities, Incorporated. James was also appointed by New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg as President of the Governor's Island Preservation and Education Corporation. He has held key roles at the New York City Economic Development Corporation, City Ratner Companies, and the New York City Department of Housing, Preservation, and Development. As Adjunct Professor at Columbia University, he teaches public-private partnerships in real estate development. James holds a Bachelor from Columbia College and completed the Master's for Sustainable Real Estate Development Program at Columbia. A Fannie Mae Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School, he is a frequent speaker at conferences, served on advisory panels, and is involved with organizations such as the Design Trust for Public Space, American LGBTQ+ Museum, ArtBridge, and the Billion Oyster Project. So please help me welcome James Lima.
I think I'm supposed to wear this. Clicker. I'll get my technology organized here. I'll be bridge. How's that? Can you hear me okay? This is just for recording purposes. Good evening. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. I'm James Lima. I am delighted to be back in Norman. I had the pleasure of being here 9 years ago for Urban Land Institute conference, advisory service panel, a week-long visit, which I'll talk about in a moment. I give you a little bit of background about our firm. We are, as Matt said, real estate and economic advisors, but we're a little bit unusual in that we focus a lot on the experience of place as a really fundamental part of economic competitiveness. And so that's a little bit of what we're going to talk about and dive into today. Okay. We're working around North America, from Calgary to the Florida Keys, from Austin to Boston. We are primarily engaged right now in southern cities and in the Midwest, but are working all over. And we love working in university and college towns. You know, they're full of diversity, and somehow that got a little mangled in the translation here. I apologize for that. Hopefully that won't be true in the slides to come. The approach to our work is, and this is true at cities of every scale, in every location, there are always more opportunities to better connect the assets you already have to one another. Does anyone think that's not true for Norman? Right? Whether it's through better streets, parks, greenways, blueways, mobility improvements, transit, bikeways. You've already made some headway in that regard and have some ambitious plans for that. This is really an opportunity to create more vibrant communities by better connecting us to each other, but also thinking about greater diversity of uses. So it's really understanding how do we create more housing choices for more people at different price points. It's a critical challenge in cities all over the country. How do we figure out how to create more vibrancy and diversity at street level at a time when the nature of retail is changing globally and was changing well before the pandemic? How do we think about vibrancy and a mix of uses at a time when the future of work is fundamentally different than it was 4 years ago in these recent weeks? And so these are exciting times, but also very challenging and require that we really take a holistic view. We focus on place and the experience of place as ways to create value and unlock value, not simply for the sake of creating economic development or creating real estate value, but more intentionally to capture some of that value that everyone's effort is creating and redirecting it. Redirecting created value specifically to pay for the things that maybe government can't do or isn't doing, that the private market isn't doing on its own, but that actually really most reflect your values as a community, your priorities as a community, whatever those are. And so when I talk about creating vibrancy and economic development, it's really as part of a mission-driven firm that I founded to really create maximum public benefit. And for all of these efforts that we're engaged in, to create this kind of vibrancy to really benefit those that most need it. As I mentioned, I was here in 2015 for a week-long intensive Urban Land Institute Advisory Service panel that looked at what the future possibilities might be for the Griffin Memorial Hospital campus. It's a really fascinating project. We got to tour through those buildings. I don't know if you've all been into some of those buildings. It was a real eye-opener. But also it was clear that this is an enormous opportunity for the city at a very important juncture and a district in the city. So excited to hear that there are some new possibilities about moving forward and what might unlock there and to address some of the aspirations you have, some of the needs you have, and the ways that that can better connect to some of the other investments and initiatives that you have. I'm going to talk today overall about what I think of as kind of a smart growth strategy for a place that already is what I think of as a community of choice, a place that people come to because it offers a quality of life, a sense of history, of cultural identity, of a cultural landscape that people feel enormous pride in. You're a region that has strong connectivity, and that is fueling the economic prosperity and the growth, the unprecedented growth that we've seen in Norman. And it's exciting to hear that you have very ambitious plans to better connect those economic, social, and cultural assets of your region to one another, so that you're not competing against one another, but actually thinking systemically as a region about your economic power and the ways that you can unlock that potential, again, for the greater good. You already have what my friend Bruce Katz calls networked governance. You have government and business, civic community, and the philanthropic community working together. And so you have this horizontal alignment across different sectors, which is so important for getting things done. It's also challenging, and one of the things I recognize, and having done a lot of work in college and university towns, is there are very particularly strong passions in university cities. And so it is certainly an opportunity and a challenge. You're a region and a city that is focused and is successful in terms of economic growth in a few key sectors, particularly bioscience, energy, logistics, aviation and aerospace, and shared services. In the same way that assets that you already have can be better connected. In cities all over the country, there are always more opportunities to create more commercialization of technological innovation. You are a world caliber research center. You have been strategic about unlocking some of that innovation and to grow an ecosystem for entrepreneurship, to think about tech transfer, as they say. But there's always more opportunity to create more good paying jobs and to have that really reflect the thing that's distinctly special about the resources and talent that you already have. It was great to see the data, again, for the region about how within the overall kind of Oklahoma City economic area as it's defined, the research and development expenditure per capita is growing significantly and is quite a solid number, as is federal spending for R&D per capita, again, growing. And access to venture capital is always a challenge. And you've seen significant improvements in that area. So keep doing what you're doing in that regard. And there are successes. There are some really notable ways that you have unlocked your potential as a university city in growing as a hub for innovation. You're also a place that is understood nationally and maybe internationally as a place of excellence and achievement in a whole bunch of areas. Now, some years are better than others, but your identity and civic pride includes your relationship to sport and recreation in ways that are so uniquely Norman and an enormous asset for you. You're also a talent machine. People lament that we don't make enough things anymore in America. Well, you make literally thousands of talented new young people entering or re-entering the workforce. And here's the thing. Every single one of those 4,343 graduates in 2022 had to make a decision. Every single one of them. Am I staying? Am I going? And so even if we got 3% more than currently make the decision to stay, that's a lot of people. That's a lot of young people, a very valuable cohort that could, again, be part of the continued growth and vibrancy of downtown. So what does it take to get people who are thinking about their future, their families, their aspirations of a quality of life that they want for themselves? What would it take? What do you need to offer that maybe right now you're not necessarily competing as well as you can? Again, we can always all compete better than we do. Again, you also are a powerhouse regionally in terms of the scale of military and civilian workers who are part of Tinker Air Force Base and the relationship that has as the largest single-site employer in the whole state. And congratulations on the recent announcement of the national survey of US cities that named you the 56th most investable city in the United States. It's a great achievement. When we think about what attracts businesses and companies to places, it often falls along a few basic lines, like a skilled workforce, the talent, the technology, both the infrastructure and the different ways that technology supports and services industry and innovation, but also transportation options and the quality of our accessibility between workforce, job centers, and then of course tax regimes, which vary from place to place, but are critical decision-making factors. Tonight, there are so many things we could talk about. I'm really going to talk about the first one. We're going to focus on talent and the aspects that really affect our ability to attract talent. Now, we're at a moment when people have never had more choices about where to live, work, learn, play. And so, particularly downtowns, which have always been the historic concentration of jobs, right? The central business district. It was like a place you were committed to, that you had no choice. You had to go to the central business district 5 days a week. Well, almost no one is doing that anymore. And so center cities in particular are doubling down on the need to remain relevant. And so I talk a lot about and quantify the economics of relevance. And what I mean by this is cities have an opportunity right now to think about a much more interesting model than the central business district. To think about something where this concentration of urbanity, of historic architecture and arts and culture, of parks, of intellectual conversations, of academic institutions and other institutions, of investments in infrastructure and industry, for that all to be one vibrant thing. And for that place to do a better job of competing for your daily interest. In other words, it's Sunday afternoon, and I think, you know what, let's go as a family, or me with my friends, to the downtown, because I have had that experience before, and that's a really enriching experience. I'm going to go back there, as opposed to feeling like I only go there because, you know, I want to watch a game, or I only go there because there's that one store that I go to. How do we create a much more vibrant set of places? And that gets to the point of the fact that capital or investment is following talent. That talent has never had more choices, right? Talent is following places. What are the compelling places that are going to offer me the greatest quality of life for me and my family, whatever that looks like? And place needs investment. And that's the juncture you're at, right? And that's what I so appreciate about the invitation to come here and the conversations we've had over recent months about your aspiration and your interest to continue to invest in your place. Take a minute to just be thinking about what do we mean by place? Well, it's in short, it's space plus people. But also, placemaking, one definition that I like is like the deliberate effort to design, activate, and manage places in a way that cultivates a connection between people and the physical space around them. So there's a lot in that quote for me, because what it tells me is it's deliberate, so we have to all work with intention. But it also suggests to me that there's a whole bunch of different people involved here. Government can't and shouldn't do all of this. The business community can't and shouldn't and won't do all of this. And there's a very long history in America now, 30, 40 years, of unsung heroes among the downtown district managers, or district management organizations broadly. It doesn't even have to be downtown, where that quasi-public, private entity gets up every day to think about that district and the importance of that curation and that ownership of an entity that is supporting both the public benefit, the public good, the public interest, but also private building owners, property owners, anchor businesses, institutions. And we see these all over the country. We'll talk a little bit more about like what defines our individual and collective experience of place, because really that's really what matters. This might sound like the soft side of economic development, but I can assure you, for the work that we're doing everywhere and the client work that we're doing coming out of the pandemic, it is foundational to economic competitiveness. The cities that are winning are the ones that are really offering incredible experiences of place. And so they have profound economic implications. We just announced last week with the mayor of St. Paul, Minnesota, a downtown investment strategy that first graphically showed in a heat map the economic power and economic output of the core of a city. The secondary, if the very tall purple is the core of the historic central business district, the secondary purple to the left is where the Minnesota Wild plays. So that is the hub of visitation and tourism for downtown St. Paul. And coming out of the pandemic, it is a much more significant part of the economic output and activity for that little downtown. And it's instructive because the data says, oh, lots of people are coming downtown, but it's all staying in that one little spot. And people are not moving through the downtown because they're not motivated to do that. A healthy downtown drives the overall city economy. And before we talk about like the economics of place, it's really worth reminding ourselves that in cities, our most central place in the city is our downtown. It has an outsized contribution to tax revenues. Again, I'm talking across the country as an economic value, and I understand you have a specific tax regime here. They tend to be they're much better in helping you compete for talent and resources, and they're central to the city's identity, image, and brand. And just a couple of examples. A typical downtown in the US has about 3% of a city's land area, and yet in a typical city, it generates 70% of property taxes. You could say this about a whole bunch of other taxes. It is 3% of the city land area, but 24% of city employment. And downtowns are much younger. In fact, they're twice as young. Twice as many people between 18 and 34 are downtown than the national population. So it is a talent attractor. So let's pivot a little bit to talk more specifically about the economics of place. And you maybe didn't know you were going to get into the weeds on our hedonic calculations of park proximity. But this chart is saying a few things. It's saying that in the past, we focused on efforts to attract office tenants and office workers. And we focused on attracting retail and food and beverage and entertainment. And those were siloed separate things that really were about incentives, how can I make it easier for you? And those things are still important. But what's very different now is to think about how interrelated these things all are, particularly this all-enveloping idea that our experience of place, or what I'm calling here in diagram, the public realm, how that affects market demand for all of those things. I am more likely to be interested in a downtown residential unit if my experience of that district is a very positive one. I'm more likely to open a retail store or F&B if there are more people who are interested in living in a place that has a quality of experience. So it's this reinforcing virtuous cycle of a vibrant, attractive public realm that's really attracting all those things. Now, also, the more arts and culture and kind of civic uses you have, and again, you have a lot of that already, those are also reinforcing and strengthening market demand for office, for housing, for retail, and the like. We can do better in downtown here. There's lots of opportunity. You have a lot of underperforming and underutilized sites. You've also done a lot of really good work, but I see it as a great opportunity to think of your center city in this new way as a central social district. The most important social place of connection and community for the region. Now, what is the central social district? The key elements that define it are more housing choices for full-time residents, people who have ownership, who are supporting small businesses. More family-friendly entertainment, so more people who don't necessarily live in the central social district and are in these quality of life ring neighborhoods, which you have lots of, feel like they really want to come because it's fun. Someone was telling me that they recently drove to St. Louis to see a museum there because it's kind of wacky and fun and a great experience for young people. So how do we create more of that? How do we create more art and cultural footprint? Because we'll talk some more about how cultural infrastructure is critical to innovation economies. More experiential retail, more diversity and equity, accessibility and inclusive aspects of your downtown. And then more parks and open space. Now for work we did for downtown Calgary in Canada, they are very much a traditional old high-density central business district. When we got there, before the pandemic, they had a 30% office vacancy rate before the pandemic. That's because they have really suffered in boom and bust economies as an energy-centric city. They are really working to try to diversify their economy, but really also to really focus on place. So one of the things I tried to focus on, because the strong line through the center of the circle is Stephen Avenue, their main street in their central business district. And I was working with a bunch of designers and engineers who were focusing on the street, like new paving, new benches, new lighting, new wayfinding. And I said, that's not what I do. I want to understand how, first of all, how is Calgary relevant in the nation's economy? How is it competing against Toronto and Vancouver and Montreal? But second, how is this part of your center city of Calgary relevant to the region? What is its role in the region? So what can Norman's role be in the region? What is the opportunity for its role to expand to in the region? And then one of the ways we started looking at it is like, what is our experience here and what can our experience here be? How can we take the assets you have, and there are many of them here, so that a tech entrepreneur who's interested in innovation in Calgary wants to be part of that cultural life. It's an incredible mountain river town, but you have no sense when you're in there downtown that they're next to this great river. So how to make stronger connections with natural assets that they have, but also really reinforce some of the things that they just weren't leveraging. So there's a case for investing in place. I co-authored with the Urban Land Institute a national document, which may be obvious to many of you, but for their 45,000 member community of real estate developers and property owners, it was really instructive for them to see the data about why the real estate industry should invest in creating and sustaining parks and open space, how it's in their financial self-interest. So there will be a quiz after this on this chart about all the ways that, now in this image, we're talking about parks and open space, but this absolutely applies to great streets. And by great streets, each one of you is an expert in what a great street is. When you have family or friends visiting you, and you want to take them someplace to kind of show off your pride of place, you have a mental map of what you're going to do and where you're going to go. And you have an idea what those streets are. Or when you go to visit someplace on vacation, you have a memory of an experience of strolling a certain way. And so the relationship of our experience of that place as tourist value, as direct economic activity, but also the hedonic value, the way that use, its adjacency affects value of things that are proximate to it, and other values like the role of wellness and health equity for being adjacent to parks and open space, and the role in stormwater management and the like, and reducing urban heat island effect. There are many, many benefits. This can translate into physical planning. And so for work that we were doing in downtown Indianapolis on the old GM stamping plant across the White River from downtown, it was a 100-acre site that had really no development anywhere near it, and yet the wildly successful Indianapolis Cultural Trail that runs through the heart of downtown Indianapolis, we propose, and it will, extend across the river through this former GM site, which is a vacant site, and become the organizing element of the civic space of a new major redevelopment. Now, one thing we'll talk about a little bit is that there's up to 25% premium in the value of property that's proximate to a great park or open space. So in the green, you're seeing like the radiating value of being near the blue, which is the trail, the extension of a trail through an otherwise untested market location. When the Indianapolis Cultural Trail was proposed and was in planning, real estate value for parcels that were proximate to the trail rose by 148%, even before it opened. We're about to start work with the Cultural Trail to think of it 10 years later, to go back and say, what lessons have been learned, how can we tweak this, and what are some new ways for them to capture more of the value that they've created in Indy. One other aspect of place that is overlooked in just about every place we work is exploiting the incredible economic power that is our interest in being part of a night economy. Your places can be much more activated and animated and populated at night. It's just a question of extending that level of activity, working with store owners, with a more well-resourced downtown management organization, and thinking about very intentional events that happen more times year-round in the evening, including when weather is bad. And we have worked on a number of projects where we just turn, severe winter weather on its head and just make it an asset. And whether it's, you look at Winnipeg and how they do an architectural competition of ice block architecture. And just it creates enormous media attention and joy and delight. And part of this is our absolute desire, and it's verified, I think, during the pandemic for all of us, of our desire and need to connect and be in community. And our center cities are the places for that. Nighttime economies are defying the perception that places are scary and unsafe at night. And so it's a way to be really intentional about programming and designing spaces, but also having stewards of those places. People, like I said, who get up during the day and stay up at night, thinking about how to make and choreograph a great district. So the other part of this, and I'll get to a little bit later, is those of you involved in place and thinking about nurturing place, whether it's at the university or in other parts of the city, you're the director, the stage manager, the usher, the choreographer. People want to know where to go and how to move. And so the more we can get people out of their cars and on their feet and connecting and spending money and lingering in our places, we're going to generate tax revenue, we're going to make people happier, they're going to come back again and again. A couple of examples. So we worked in a very pesky site in the center of a really important retail corridor in Asheville, North Carolina. A really successful retail corridor. And so sales were pretty good, except you get to the end of the corridor and the city owned a crappy parking lot on a steeply sloped site. They were, for years, it was just called like this hopeless redevelopment project that they could never figure out, and it was dubbed the pit of despair. Well, it was literally the front door of their conference center, their performing arts center, their public library, their public arcade and market, their historic basilica, and other residential. And yet, it was an asphalt parking lot. And so we reimagined both the streets to create great streets, did a road diet, and created a more developable parcel that was both park, new front door address as a great park, worthy of this very civic place in the life of the city, but also a new mid-rise development that would generate ground rent revenue to sustain the park, but also activate and animate the space. So it's a way of balancing development and new open space, and really enhancing the viability and market appeal and competitiveness of some of those places. And so what was the pit of despair is now referred to as the slope of hope. Along the bluff in Memphis, we worked on a park plan for the Mississippi riverfront. Our work was really focused on the diagram to the right, which I know is hard to read, but imagine there are 12 different potential users. And this gets back to the question of the economics of relevance. As we think about like what park spaces should be and trails should be and reimagined focus areas for our revitalization efforts, it's worth storyboarding a little bit and saying, what is the role of this place for a retired couple who likes to go for long morning walks, for a cyclist who's looking for a place to stop and get some energy or a bottle of water, for a business tourist, for the cultural tourist, for any number of other categories of people. How do we create relevance for more groups of people by thinking about the design of it and the way that it's programmed and activated? Again, in a place in Tennessee, Blount County, just south of Knoxville, that has been hugely successful in attracting advanced manufacturing, particularly Japanese electronics manufacturing, they've had a terrible time of attracting people. Partly because they don't have a lot of housing choices, and partly because, to their admission, and why they came to us, they don't really have compelling places. They haven't really been investing in communities that are really competing with some of their peer cities. We did a whole kind of regional economic opportunities analysis, and one of the things we came up with, just as an example to highlight, is what we've dubbed the Smoky Mountain Greenway. And it would be a 40-mile greenway, bike and ped connection from Knoxville through Alcoa, Maryville to Townsend into the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, which is spectacular. But it would go through the center of those small cities in ways that create organizers in very much the way that your legacy trail is starting to create a new energy and connection between your economic, social, and cultural assets. And there's also an opportunity to think about co-development alongside them. How do we unlock the greater potential? I'll mention just a few other things as additional considerations for talent attraction and retention. We could probably talk the rest of the night about this topic, and I understand your first CiviCon was actually about housing. But I'll just reinforce that there are an almost infinite number of examples now of very high quality, well-designed housing that you could look to as sort of a pattern book. You could have someone make a book for you of 100 examples of the things you love and would love to see land in your various sites that are available over time. And then, almost as important, a list of 100 things you definitely don't want to see any more of. Every city has a bunch of dog projects that just get built and they're a little homely and they're not adding anything. Or they're built in a way that really doesn't reflect your community. I think a lot of people's understanding of affordable housing dates back to some flawed programs from the 60s and 70s where there were concentrations of 100% low-income housing that were built to poor quality standards and not maintained very well. And so they end up being anything but an asset to the community. And so we have a bias against what we think of as affordable housing. But high quality housing choices at every price point, including workforce housing or other forms of attainable housing. There are great organizations that do artist-specific, artist-eligible affordable housing to sustain your creative community. Those are all options to be thinking about. You are already a nascent innovation economy and growing. And one of the things, again, I sometimes feel like I'm talking about the kind of the soft side of economic development, but I have found that in talking to the decision makers about location, it really does come back to quality of life and aspirations that individual human beings have for themselves. It turns out companies are actually made up of a bunch of individual human beings, right? So it's not a corporate policy that's saying, we are going to cities of 100 to 150,000 people. You know, like, it's not working that way. It's working that companies want to attract and retain the best people. And those people have never had more choices. So cultural infrastructure in the broadest sense, and here's, you know, one of your great street fairs, this you can't do enough of. Like, keep thickening that and just thinking of ways to have daytime, nighttime, seasonal events that create great experiences for locals, for sure, first and foremost, but also for visitors, to just keep that tourist population coming. That generates enormous economic value to keep tourists coming to your many festivals. On the arts and culture front, we've been doing a master plan for downtown Orlando. A beautiful facility, actually extraordinary. The Dr. Phillips Center is a $350 million performing arts center. You don't need this. But it's also a cautionary tale. For all of its world caliber credential, it is surrounded by too many fast-moving lanes that are very pedestrian unfriendly. So it's a spectacular facility on an island that right now isn't encouraging you to like stroll, to linger, to go to a family sit-down restaurant before or after the show. And so there's an economic implication for that that has got to be addressed. So that was a big part of our work, was like taming the streets. The more ways that the individually owned car can be slowed down and sort of removed from places that we know are going to be economically valuable as walkable centers, we need to be doing that. The other thing that we need to do in terms of place is not just think about the formal, the big projects, but the informal ecosystems. And so that starts with schools and with not-for-profit organizations, finding ways for the philanthropic community in particular, but also for government, to nurture what we call informal cultural infrastructure. And you have that. You have been doing, your second Friday art walk. These are ways to just support small arts organizations, galleries, but also really create an identity and a brand that is very appealing to a lot of people. Back in Orlando, the organization Fringe has taken up residence right in a very strategic place in the heart of downtown, and they are programming the heck out of these spaces for families, for nighttime events for adults. It's fantastic. It was one of the first things they did coming out of our set of recommendations, and it's just thrilling to see how much attention is getting on social media, in the general media, about the vibrancy and energy and relevance that downtown is having. It's the message is, wish you were here. Like, look at what a great time we're having here. We want to have more of that. For a master plan we've done for the waterfront in downtown Jacksonville, Florida, it was thinking about an activation strategy, but the important thing here for us was to think about the governance role. And I just bring this up because there is a role for everyone here. And this was a really important point in our kind of wrap up with the mayor in St. Paul last week, was there's a very important role for government that should be prescribed and defined. There's a really important role for business community, sometimes more reflected in a downtown management organization, which I think you have a lot of opportunity to strengthen as well. Your university is an enormous stakeholder, and your other institutions are important stakeholders. And then the civic community and the community at large, as they've been represented in One Norman and other processes, are really important voices. But who has a seat at the table in making decisions about how money is allocated every year to choreograph, to curate your place, to reflect whose values, right? How is that broadly representative of who you are as a community? I'm only asking it to pose the question of things to be thinking about. Do all the people who should have a seat at the table have a seat at the table so that we are represented? But also, are we leveraging the value of philanthropy of the private sector and not relying on government, which tends to not have the resources to properly maintain and program parks and open space? And then another thing, for economic competitiveness, particularly for innovation economies, they are drawn to places that embrace diversity. So again, you have another asset here where, like, okay, so Oklahoma in general isn't the most diverse place in America, but as a city in the state, you embrace diversity, and your student body is certainly very diverse. As we attract and retain more of those graduates, can we also become more diverse? And how does some of that translate into also supporting more small business? The Kitchen Incubator in Chattanooga is a great example of ways that more access to economic opportunity in the food service business is a great catalyst and resource for a growing tourism and hospitality community. So how do we create about systems where our tourism industry, which the Lieutenant Governor talked today about being so important for Norman, is sustained by an increasingly diverse group of small businesses that are given greater economic opportunity. And your Startup 405 in Cleveland County is, a home for entrepreneurs and a really good example of making the effort to incubate and to create that sort of nurturing environment. And lastly, you are a place that is both city and within an incredible natural system. And in terms of economic competitiveness, the cities that are most attractive around the United States are the ones that offer both vitality and urbanity, but also close proximity to nature, to trails, to hiking, to national parks, to these beautiful places that we can escape to individually and with our families. And so ways for more of that to find its way into the DNA of the center city and your identity and your brand. And again, to come back to the idea that the public realm, broadly speaking, is that set of places where we meet, where we connect, that our parks, our open spaces, our great streets, that are economic, social, and cultural connectors, and that whether it's any of these 5 sectors where we think of sort of normal economic development investments, that we think about enhancing the viability of them, of the financial feasibility of them, and the economic benefits of them by a more compelling public realm. Thank you.
Time for a couple questions?
Sure.
All right. So I wrote a few questions here to ask Mr. Lima. First of all, I'll just say, what a great presentation. That was awesome. So in what ways can placemaking initiatives contribute to reducing crime rates and increasing feelings of safety among residents?
Great question. There are a few ways. One is the obvious things of really addressing lighting and thinking about how we feel in places based on how they're lit, how clear sight lines are, where we are and where we need to go. And then, being very mindful of places that are encouraging hiding out, right? We did some work in New York City on this with the police department and the mayor's office of criminal justice specifically, and it was really about finding ways to create more activation on streets that had data about very high crime, where there were concessions where possible, trying to add more hours of day and night programming. We mapped the number of hours of activation of high crime streets and identified where there was a relationship between no activity, no programming, no foot traffic, and crime. And then tried to target those, like how do we get more foot traffic? And some of it was creating a more clear hierarchy of how to get people to move on certain streets and encourage people to use certain streets and not others so much. So that we could both concentrate on creating safe corridors and minimizing the chance that somebody on one of those kind of off-center streets was going to be more likely to experience crime.
No, it makes sense, yeah. More eyes on the street, safer streets. Pretty simple. Okay, so how does placemaking address issues of social equity and accessibility, particularly for marginalized or underserved communities?
Yeah, it's a great question. Who feels welcomed in places? Who feels like the programming, the design, the way a place is operated is welcoming to them, or that people like them are represented there? That's a question that we work on all the time. And it really gets back to the question of stewardship and governance, and who's making these decisions about what something looks like, who it's for, how it is relevant to their culture, to their lives, in terms of programming and place. And what's exciting is to see when you're intentional about addressing that and really diversifying the programming, how people respond. Because people, they're not necessarily accustomed to seeing a representation of people who look like them. So it works.
No, absolutely. When you do things by intention, you get desired outcomes. If you do things by happenstance, by accident, you get accidental outcomes. And so I think you're spot on with that. So,
I found foundations are particularly fond of supporting those kinds of things. So there are sources of funding.
Excellent. Okay, well, this one, last question is very near and dear to my heart. Can you discuss the role of placemaking in promoting active transportation and reducing reliance on cars in urban environments?
Our firm works probably mostly on transit-oriented development projects or trying to create them. And I think the more that we are out of our cars and walking in places, but also that we have the freedom to have choices. I mean, we love our cars, and our cars are a form of freedom, but there's something very freeing also having the choice of not having to drive, to go to a fun event and maybe drink a little bit too much and then get on a train and know you're going to get home safe. So, but also just knowing that you have more housing choices because your place of employment, if you have to be in a physical place of employment, has more options for connectivity. And so better connecting people to job centers, connecting your cultural assets, your university, your downtown with transit. It's also obviously all the environmental and health benefits.
Right, yeah, Oklahoma being a very car-centric state is something we struggle with just across the board. So really appreciate your insight on that.
And like, who would have thought that Florida would have this incredibly successful train line that now links Miami to Orlando, and people love it, the Bright Line. People who normally do not take public transportation are loving the option of going, from one metropolitan area to another. Taking a mega regional approach to infrastructure investment is very strategic.
Well, hopefully we'll see some, as you alluded to, some successes of the RTA, and I know we're all very excited for that vote, and fingers crossed, like you said. So, Well, James, thank you very much for being here tonight. I hope everybody can see the value of placemaking, not just economic value, but cultural value, historic value, physical health and well-being value, social value. There's a lot of buckets that fill up when you do places the right way. So,
Do you want to take any questions?
yeah, if there's any questions from the audience, I mean, I think our speaker is generous enough to answer those, which is a first.
Are we close enough to a major metropolitan area that we can develop our own sense of identity in revitalizing our downtown?
Absolutely. You have a beautiful center city. Yeah, I think it has a history and a quality to it and a walkability that is very appealing. And there's also a lot of opportunity to, I would think of as sort of thickening the programming and activation. And more downtown residential would be a really good thing.
You know, love the pictures. You know, you'd want to live at those places. It's pretty clear. And I've been to Davidson, North Carolina's a little town north of Charlotte that's got that kind of ambiance that makes you want to be there. Getting from here to there is what I'm trying to figure out. Where does the money come from? It's going to take a lot of capital. You mentioned nobody can do it by themselves. In your experience, what have you found to be the recipe for success in transforming a community? And where does the capital come from and how does it gather?
Yeah, that's a great question. In my experience, and I'm now pretty old, and I've seen that government takes the first risk. I think the most important thing is there's an alignment of interest that's established first, where the business community, institutions, and government recognize that there's a mutual shared interest. And then government takes the first risk in terms of investment, usually in critical infrastructure. But the private sector also makes a significant commitment, and institutions make commitments. And when I say government, I mean state, you know, hopefully federal. There's never been more of a flow of federal funding right now. I mean, one of our projects in Atlanta got $157 million last week. The one in Jacksonville got $147 million. I mean, the numbers are astonishing. And so there's money for critical infrastructure, for transportation alternatives, for climate adaptation, for equitable access to economic development, in some cases for housing. You know, like working with your congressional delegation to get whatever you can from the federal government for sure. And again, aligned around these important principles of equity and economic growth and leveraging public money with private money. Convene industry that you have and obviously the university to really think about how to unlock the greater potential of this coalition working together around this. And use data to demonstrate. So we find showing economic benefit analyses, which I'm sure the university does all the time. We're working with a major technology university now on a kind of nanotech and quantum computational center that is an $11 billion new hub of activity that will be largely privately funded. But it took a lot of communication about the ability for catalytic public money to organize and stimulate strong private investment. You have a very distinctive place that has this huge benefit of having a major university. And you're within a very healthy, prosperous region, and a mega region. So I think there really is a lot of opportunity, but I think it's going to take, as it did in other Oklahoma cities, for the business community, philanthropic community, and government to all work together.
Go ahead.
Oh, in the back.
So your focus tonight for on development in the center of Norman, but the city and the university are considering a new project more on the periphery of Norman, right off of the interstate. Have you found that that sort of development away from the core downtown areas, is that detrimental to the downtown areas as it shifts of focus somewhere else?
Not necessarily. Every city is a unique circumstance, and cities are made up of multiple nodes. So there are different personalities to different places. Orlando, for example, has a strong core, but it has very significant healthcare anchored districts at bookending both ends outside of the downtown that are really important, that are continuing to grow and are now going to be more connected by transit. I think having it connected with a healthy transit network would be a smart idea, but I don't know a lot of details about the proposal.
Do you think using $220 million worth of citizens' taxpayers' dollars to do a TIF for a marina and entertainment area is a good thing?
If you hire me, I'll tell you.
I'm not gonna hire you. I came to see you to ask the question.
The good news is that I don't give flipped answers to complicated questions. That is a great question that is worthy of very deep. Well, you have to do the analysis to understand. It's a cost-benefit analysis that somebody has to really do the work to say, here's the benefit that it would generate, and here's the cost. And sometimes it doesn't, and often it does. But every situation is unique. So I couldn't answer it without knowing the data.
The non-answer.
No, it's as
Be
answer.
respectful of our guest. Thank you. James Howard.
You may be, oh, you talking, that's fine, sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay, well, you're probably familiar with what's gone on in Oklahoma City over the past 30 years with maps. It's nationally renowned. There's a lot of attention, and it's been a renaissance for Oklahoma City. Pretty much anyone you ask is, what's your familiarity with that, and what's your opinion about what's happened in Oklahoma City compared with some of the other places that you've seen?
I don't have a lot of familiarity with Oklahoma City,
Okay.
except to have enjoyed a very nice closing dinner for our Norman Urban Land Institute Week Advisory Service Panel at a dinner atop the new tower that was built. But I think there's been a real intention to kind of take back the public space and to create a more compelling experience of that place. It's clear that there were some significant business investments as well, in addition to government.
Right, there have been. And so you were there in 2015 then?
That's right. Yeah. I think one of the things that we know is that they have a very strong downtown district management organization. I think that Norman would benefit from really investigating that.
One example, the tower that you were in, I know that tower well, and I know that that tower would not have been built if maps, those different maps programs had not been passed because of the improvements to that area, which is an example of kind of what you're talking about.
Yeah. You certainly don't need tall buildings. It doesn't seem like your identity. It strikes me as
Norman doesn't need tall buildings?
right.
Yeah, sure, but the private investment, you talk about private investment follows public investment.
Yeah, I think it's worth really investigating more about like what have been barriers to private investment and why are achievable rents as low as they are here. And so what are ways to address that so that things are more financeable. Also, I didn't really talk about this, but one of the challenges you have is that as a state, county, and city, there's not a big commitment to funding affordable housing, unlike a lot of your peer cities. And that's not helping, because the need is everywhere. And I'm not talking about low-income housing, I'm just talking about housing that the private market on its own is not providing. There's a role for government to help assist, to create some additional incentives so that more people can access housing. Sorry,
No, thank you. I'm patient, not a big deal. So throughout your talk, you mentioned open space, parks, the value in that, the attractiveness of it. And then you also mentioned in one slide the corridor, the Greenbelt corridor from Knoxville down to National Park. You know, and you had lots of great images of these wonderful cities that are located on riverfronts, and you know they have that access to to nature right there. When you look at a city like Norman, where probably our two biggest natural assets, being the river and the lake, are quite a distance away from our core downtown, and looking at, there's only so far we can stretch a dollar. If you were to focus on one or the other, would it be the parks and open space, or would it be on the infrastructure, or what would be the right mix of approach to invigorate one or the other to be successful for Norman?
To invigorate the riverfront or the lakefront?
Or any of the above. Downtown parks, whatever that might be. Would you focus on downtown parks or those more distant natural resources?
I mean, I would love to be able to answer that question, but I simply don't know enough about your place yet to know. But the Lieutenant Governor mentioned today that shoreline activation and access should be more of a priority, and we should be doing more to really access that and take advantage of that as an amenity for more people. And I don't know if people generally feel that that's a great idea, or if it's an environmental threat, or I just don't know enough. I think it's great that you have these natural features and destinations close in to the city, and it's a huge benefit. Whether everyone has to get there by their individual car is another thing, but that's not the worst thing either. But I think creating more ways that more people can feel like they've made a choice to be in a place that offers them a proud lifestyle. People love to say, yeah, I live in that block by the farmer's market, and it's like, I'm by the farmer's market that everybody loves to come to on Saturday morning. It's a source of pride that they've made a good life decision in a way. Like I'm living my values. I want to be in this community. I want to connect with people. I want to eat healthy food. I want to support local agriculture, farmers. I think the same is true. Like the boating community, the fishing community, the hunting community, the hiking communities. These are parts of your heritage and the cultural landscape, and those things run deep, and really just embracing that, but finding ways for that to also be in the city. So in Blood County, we were talking to bicycle manufacturers. Say, well, what would it take to get you to open a factory to make super high-end bicycles here? Because this is going to be one of the great bike trails. And a local billionaire actually created on his property this crazy extreme bike, off-road bike trail. And so things like that, where there's an economic component, there's a media, branding, identity component, but an activation and programming and cultural piece to it. Like, how do you keep tying those things together? I know in my Uber coming from the airport, we almost got hit by a boat last night. That was like driving the trail.
I think in the end, it just goes back to your comment about money follows people, or, if the people are there, then it's going to be a good thing. So I think if we ask the people, what do you want the most, get that done. That will create the energy for the next project. And the people just being proud of where they are, the access to those things they want in their lives.
We always start with a competitor analysis. So you know who your competitor cities are, and that's usually a great place to start. Like, who are the 5 or 10 cities that we're always or often, like not successfully competing against? And where's our aspirational community? Like we beat these guys, but we want to get to that level. And then just pick off, like, what are the things? Like, where are you stronger or weaker relative to the aspirational peer? And then focus on those things. It works, because again, you're getting at, like, what are the decision-making points that are making a family? Because I thought it was interesting today, there was a conversation about, like, the things that are going to make somebody choose to locate their business. I think it's much more of a family decision. So you really want to be thinking about how am I creating a quality of life for the whole family? It's not just the business. It's not the real estate scout for the company. It's the whole system.
So a city like Norman, where I would describe just close enough to a larger city and just far enough away from it, that we can have our own identity, but also benefit from the proximity of a bigger city. In your experience, what may cities like Norman be doing to leverage the things that were mentioned about Oklahoma City, like the maps and professional sports and a lot of private investment, or one of the largest military installations in the country? How can a place like Norman, or what have you seen maybe, what would we use or leverage all of that in our favor? So come to Norman, you can benefit from all those things that have in Oklahoma City, but you want to live in Norman though. Because
That was really interesting. We're working in Columbus, Indiana, which is about 40 minutes outside of Indy. And, small city, but incredible, and has so many opportunities to better connect things to each other. But also, we just finished our work in St. Paul, and that's always feels like it's in the long shadow of Minneapolis, which is much bigger and has much more infrastructure and bigger population. But with St. Paul, I think that's a good example of St. Paul for you. I'd much rather live in St. Paul. And I'd rather live in Norman than Oklahoma City. It's small, people, it's got a scale that is appealing. I think you don't need to appeal to everybody. You just need to keep focusing on the quality of life as a place that's got this sort of personality. Again, I'm projecting my own values on this. Norman in the future should be the place that reflect your values, whatever those are. Like, if you want to grow, I was on a Mayor's Institute panel with the mayor of Santa Clara, California, and they have a major new stadium, and they've just, even before that, they doubled their population. They changed a lot in ways that caused them to have to do a lot to think about it. But they wanted it. Like, this is what they decided, and so they embraced that. In some places, like where I grew up in New England, they don't want to change it all. Like, it's frozen in amber. The town is Little Compton, and the bumper sticker is Little Compton, let's keep it little. So I get that I think the thing that's maybe unique about Norman is it's geographically quite large. So there are a lot of opportunities to preserve community character and focus on land conservation and preservation, and still allow for economic growth in a smart growth strategy, particularly if you've got some transit investments. And I think that's where it's just clear that this is not a zero-sum game. you really can do both. And with very much with a mind to like preserving the city's overall identity and character.
Question going back a little way. I like what you just said, though, by the way. Preserving rural and high-density type cultures. I want to make sure I've got some takeaways right on affordable housing. I heard you mention kind of toward the beginning that affordable housing got a bad name in the 60s and 70s with the kind of, the poor quality housing that was 100% low-income people. And then I think I heard you say a little while later that we're not doing enough, or in your mind here in this area, to promote or invest in affordable housing. What can we do, like specific examples, to promote, invest, get affordable housing going that is the type of affordable housing that you're talking about, that's workable, sustainable, that's not, the old style stereotype that we all decided didn't work?
So it's simple, it's just gap financing. So the private development world has to make enough profit to be motivated to be involved in development. So that's a given. Let's call it 20% return on their money. It costs a fixed amount to build a housing unit. That's a function of wherever we are in the economy and the price of things. And then there's the revenue you can achieve from building a unit and renting it out. And so right now there's an imbalance. The costs are too high relative to the somewhat modest rental income that Norman, as a residential market, can achieve. That formula is true in a lot of places. So what's typical is that government then bridges the gap. We figure out, like, all right, what does land cost? What do buildings cost to build? What is the profit to the developer? And what can I rent it for? Revenue side. And then what's the gap? And maybe you're short $40,000 per unit that you build. And so you have to figure out among the smart people in your community, what are some financing structures, economic structures to create either a fund, to create like a second mortgage, or to provide tax-exempt bond financing for the permanent financing for an apartment building that pays off the construction loan, or start to use low-income housing tax credits, which can provide tax credit equity for mixed income projects that are the primary source of financing around the country for affordable housing. Those are all tools. But you could create a special fund. As in St. Paul, we're creating a special fund to convert office, Class B and C vacant office space. They have an excess of office, converting that to residential. It was an agreement between business and government and the downtown management organization. That was a priority, and so there's a fund that will help bridge that gap of converting from office to residential. Same thing here. You could create a special fund, use tax credits. You don't really have a lot of resources at the state, county, and city level, unlike some other states. So you have to figure out some other fund if you say that's a collective priority.
Yeah, that's another issue here is our source of city funding. We have to rely on sales tax. Are there places where it has worked? You mentioned St. Paul. Did St. Paul, the city of St. Paul, successfully provide the funding that helped affordable housing work there? And if so, what source did they use? Sales tax money?
Well, I will tell you in a number of places, from Calgary, which initially didn't want to make a big commitment to do this. Then the pandemic hit. Remember I told you they had a 30% vacancy rate before the pandemic? Well, once the pandemic came, now their back was really against the wall. So even the fiscally conservative provincial government, which is kind of like their state, they got behind it. The city council and the mayor got behind it and created an over $100 million fund to address the problem. In St. Paul last week, it was a really profound moment of everybody coming together, and as a closeout, it was sort of my job to say, your economic future could go either way. You could be successful, which it feels like you're going to because you have this vision of where you want to go, or we could be lukewarm in our commitments to create the funding to actually implement this plan and turn it into an action plan. And the consequences of that for them are dire. So we had a very frank conversation about the opportunity cost of not acting. I think, in a way, there's a substantial opportunity cost for you to not act boldly, to address what at today's Chamber of Commerce luncheon was identified as a likely need of 23,000 affordable housing units in the next 21 years. What can you do to affect? Now, ideally, the graph of government money in, let's try to do this from your angle, is high in the early years and then goes down. And then government doesn't want to take a lot of risk early on, but over time starts taking a lot more of the financing risk of housing. So these things crisscross. But that top loss risk that government takes to stimulate various projects is something that sounds like you need now in affordable housing. Like, we'll do it for 5 years. We'll create a whole new market dynamic. We'll get 1,000 new people living in the center city. And it'll be at different affordability levels. And we'll insist that it be super high quality in terms of design and layouts and materiality. And there, like I said, there are so many great examples of really high quality neighborhood enhancing buildings that nobody knows by looking at it that it's anything but a great building. It just happens to be 20% affordable, 30% affordable, whatever it is. So those are some ideas.
So I think we got time for one more question.
Just to wrap that, maybe, you made a comment earlier about affordable housing, and we've talked about workforce housing, different kinds of housing. And then you said low-income housing, but not low-income housing. So we're hearing lots of definitions and have had lots of conversations, but so your definition of low-income housing, and what is that, and what does it do or create? And affordable housing, workforce housing, the different, synonyms along that line. Can you give us maybe how the definitions work in the world and what's happening in those different sectors?
It's very different in different parts of the country. It's really kind of a political thing. Some people do not want you to say affordable housing because that's like a flashpoint for some people. Workforce housing generally refers to the upper end of affordable housing programs. So it's still income restricted, but it's generally referred to as like a working couple that are maybe each making $60,000 to $70,000. Teacher, fire, some service worker that maybe it's not the highest salary, but on kind of government wage, but where the private market's not necessarily meeting their needs. There's low, moderate, middle, and then there's special needs housing, which is either senior housing, affordable senior housing, or affordable housing and services for people with disabilities or other special needs. Well, I think when I was saying low, I was just referring to, in that instance of what I was talking about, I wasn't talking about necessarily skewing to the lowest affordability band. But again, your affordable housing strategy should reflect what you most need and the political realities of what you can get financed, where government's willing to contribute. But ultimately, it should address the greatest need.
So unfortunately, I think we've run out of time on that, but it's clear that, you know, you got people thinking and you got people wanting to get engaged. So I just want to say thank you again for just a wonderful presentation. Can we get a round of applause for Mr.